My name is Nathaniel Ortiz, and this is my Trinity Project over why a triune God is a sufficient and viable option as an objective moral standard. I'm doing this project this way because I am a pool manager for the city of Grapevine and spend a lot of time in a break room with high school and college age people who have grown up in this moral relativist mindset and worldview, in which they haven't been classically educated, and honestly this demographic just does not think about their lives the way people throughout history have thought about it. And so I wanted to do a little bit of a Socratic dialogue presentation on the existence of God because of moral values, and a small explanation of why a triune God actually fits and is sufficient to fit that framework. This is coming based off of, rather than going for a philosophical argument that there are some really good ones out there, but the idea is, can we share those ideas with this generation in a compelling way that they can understand? And I find that the way to do that is actually just through asking questions and conversation. And so the main conversation gets started on this idea of, are there really moral values, and where do they come from if they do exist? That first question is usually a resounding yes. You can ask other questions of, what do you think is wrong about the world? Do you think there's any goodness? Do you think that there's any evil or things that you disagree with? Usually people will come to, rape or genocide or murder, war, sexism. There's things that we would agree, that's wrong. For whatever reason, it's wrong and I disagree with it. The second question usually gets a little more variety in its answer of, well, they come from my parents. I was taught my values. And where do your parents' values come from? Well, their parents, or the education system, or the government. When you ask a couple more questions and push it further, high schoolers and college students usually come to this naturalistic evolutionary worldview that they've been taught of moral values exist and have come about into being because of the survival of the species and the flourishing of the species. The sole value for moral values is just to keep the species alive and going, and to experience flourishing in whatever way that looks. That can look different in different cultures and societies. While this philosophy and worldview seems plausible and valid in a mental picture, I think we find that it really breaks down, and it really breaks down when it comes into practical application. And can you live out that worldview? There are two main dilemmas that I find issue with. The first is the improvement dilemma, as I like to call it. The idea that if there's no God or objective moral standard, then there's no real progress or improvement in society's morals. However much we want to say that we've progressed and we've grown and we're getting better as a species, there's no real possibility of that without an objective standard with which to hold ourselves to. If you look back at history and we look at slavery, for example, we would like to say, oh no, that was wrong and we've moved on from that. But if there's no standard by which to say that is definitely wrong, then all we can really say about it is that, well, it's different. And we don't think the same way now, but we can't say it's wrong or evil, so it's just we change for whatever reason. And we also open ourselves and expose ourselves to this idea that, what if we went back to that kind of thing? What about all the other societies that don't have the same values as us? Can we really say that ours are better or worse than theirs? Or really that we're all just different and no one has anything they can say about actually judging the moral goodness or badness of any of our views? And we're opening ourselves to a world that is really messed up and in which we have to face suffering and other people's actions against us, like slavery. We can say that, sure, the slaves probably came into flourishing and probably can say, their lives improved. Slave owners might not say that. You can say that for all sorts of things. Conquered lands and people groups would say that, theirs actually declined. Their moral values and flourishing in life declined, whereas the people who conquered them probably improved. That's how we talk and how we think, and yet without a moral objective standard, There's no reality of that. Now, oftentimes, this is where you get the objection of, well, that's where survival of the fittest comes in. We do have real instincts that tell us whether or not we need to improve or decline and give us judgments in those things. But the instincts are really just for, again, survival. They tell us how to push the species forward. And high school students and college students might not talk like that, but there is this idea of, well, it's a gut instinct. It's whatever I think or you think or whatever you feel is right. This is often now moving into the second dilemma that I like to call the arbitrator's dilemma. When we have two moral values that clash against each other, who's to say which is right? And we can say, well, there's no need to know which is right. We can just respect each other's values. And tolerance works for maybe small things like your political views or where you should go to school and things like that. But the moment it gets to anything more severe, like rape or genocide or murder, all of a sudden tolerance has to fall immediately. Our justice system operates on this way of, we have certain values and constitutional values that our judicial system and the judges in that system are making calls on. If there's not an objective moral standard by which everyone needs to be held to, then there's no such thing as criminals because there's no such thing as real bad behavior. And what happens when my view is going to cause me to infringe on your view? You think about this idea, although violent in the context of rape. If just imagine that there's a person who is not attractive and is not intelligent, but they are strong and they can subdue a mate and further their DNA and their genetic pool. And yet to do that, they'd have to subdue someone else, which would go against their value system. Who's right? Without an objective moral standard, we can't actually say, no, they're definitely wrong. We can only say, well, they have a different view than me. And there's no real way to live in a world like that. That's just not even actually how we live. And no one actually agrees with that. And so from there, we get to this idea of, if we can suppose there is a God, or at least some objective moral standard, then the question becomes who or what. Let's just say this does exist, then what is it and can it be known? For that question, I would say, if it can't be known, then there's really no difference between if it existed or did not exist. If we couldn't know the moral values that are absolute, then there's really no difference in practicality of us being able to use a standard like that. So it has to be able to be known or be revealed in some way. Now, right here, there's one more objection and challenge that frequently comes up. And it was brought up in one of Plato's dialogues called the Euthyphro Dilemma by the same title, which goes something like this. Basically, either something is good because God or the moral standard wills it, or God wills it because it is good. Now, that second idea of God wills it because it is good has issues, because if we were to say that this moral standard in God says, oh, those are good values, I'm going to tell them to do that, then the moral standard is having to pull from something outside of itself to give value. That whole idea of, well, okay, where is that standard? That thing that God is looking to give him what is good and bad. What is that pulling from? And it goes on and on and on, in which case there's really no real objective standard because it's constantly pulling from something else. The other one of, if something is good because God wills it, has an issue because it almost seems arbitrary. This idea that God can say, this is good and this is bad, and it's not really based on anything besides what God decided that day. We can almost imagine this society in which people say, oh, wait, God said murder is good now, so all the religious people have to start murdering because the values changed and we want to obey those values. Both of those have serious problems, and we would find ourselves stuck in between them unless there's a third alternative that fits the framework better and is more reasonable. And here the idea would be that a God who is necessarily good and just, to which he doesn't have to look outside of himself to find what's good and evil, and he's not making arbitrary calls. Rather, he's actually operating on who he is, that he's necessarily good, and all the things that we experience that are good and beautiful, and our sense of justice and our sense of morality in general, all stems and is derived from a God who is necessarily all those things. If we can continue with the assertion that this God exists, even just for the sake of a thought experiment, and that he is the standard for our objective moral values, this is now where I would propose that a triune God is the most sufficient and satisfactory person that would necessarily fit the description portrayed. So let's take, for example, the value of love. And we don't have time to go into what is love? Does love exist? All these things. Most, especially high school and college students, we would all probably agree that there is at least an ideal of love that we can ascertain mentally. This idea that in most of us have probably experienced some of that love. And even when we haven't, we have movies and thoughts and desires of what it would be like to be loved and to experience that affection and commitment and all those things in some way. And if we were to insert love into the beginning of this entire argument, the idea that where do moral values come from? If we were to say, where does love come from? And then follow the whole train of thought again, we'd come to this conclusion that, well, we know love exists. We have real experiences of it. We have tangible knowledge of it. Then where does it come from? Well, then it must come from this objective moral standard. And based on that Euthyphro dilemma, we understand that, okay, this God necessarily must be loving because he wouldn't be pulling it from outside of himself, and he wouldn't just arbitrarily be saying, this is what love is, do it. He himself would be love. And so we're drawn to this question, and as Michael Reeves talks about in his book, Delighting in the Trinity, we get a lot of these ideas of, can someone be loving if he has nothing to love? Can this God actually be loving if he does not have someone always there to love? And this matters because if God were to be fully alone and have nothing to love, then at one point, if the love that we see in our world were to exist, it would have to come into existence, meaning that love would not have always existed. And going back to that dilemma of, well, then at one point, God decided that he would be loving and he created something to love. But that also means that at one point he could not be loving and that he can go back and forth and that it's at his will. And how do we know? So there's a necessity that there is someone always there to love. And this is where we get the Trinity, this idea that the God the Father has eternally existed with the Son and someone who he loves the Son, and that there's actually a third person, the Spirit, with which God bestows upon the Son and gives to the Son and shares with the Son in this triune communal love. And you might say that makes no sense practically, but when we think about it in our world, if someone was to be alone and have love, we wouldn't think of that as real love. We would think of that as narcissism or pride, this kind of self-love that is really internally focused and doesn't share it all. And so you'd say, okay, well, someone has something to love, and then you have two persons. Well, even two persons can have an infatuated love that is so focused on the one person and the other that we're not focused on anything else and we're ignorant of it. And even that wouldn't match an ideal of love that we can experience in this world, of a communal, sacrificial love in which we give ourselves up for each other. That's the most frequent story when you look at Western books and movies, this idea of someone willing to give his life for someone else or give himself up for it. We love the idea of a sacrificial hero and a communal love, which would require then that there would actually be a community and not just a duo of love, which we see in the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, especially when we see Jesus' baptism and this idea that the Father gives and the Spirit extends from the Father to the Son. And the one thing, and the reason I would say this is a viable and sufficient option is because when we look at other worldviews and belief systems that agree on, yeah, there's definitely an objective moral standard. What is it? You have ones that have a single alone, we'll call them an alone standard, that when we look at love and we put values to it and test that idea, you get that, well, it can't really love, or it runs into all the dilemmas that it doesn't have anyone else with it eternally and forever before we existed to love, which means that it doesn't really, all the values that we see in this world can't fully flow from that kind of standard or God. But you go on the hard opposite side of, well, what about many gods or a bunch of different standards that exist? And at the same time, those gods and those standards can't fully experience a community of love that is fully unified in one person. That's where we get this concept of the Trinity being one God and three persons. It's a full, there are distinct persons in one God, that they can experience true sacrificial shared love in one unified God that other gods can't offer either. And you get this split sense of morality. And this is why, although it's not full-fledged and all-encompassing, and there's a number of things we could talk about, this, I think, is a good conversation and framework that is compelling, that maps on to the way we see the world and things we experience, and is also reasonable and rational. Thank you for listening.